Welcome back. We're looking at Donald Trump's first 100 days in office. Still with us, Jenny Town, Assistant Director of the US Career Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And joining us for this part of the show, Sonia Dridi. She's a journalist with France 24 and Europe 1. And Lester Munson is Vice President of International Government Affairs at the lobbying group BGR. Jenny, we've been talking about the DPRK, Korean Peninsula, but there's been so much other stuff going on as well. Do you think sort of the indecision over what's happening in the DPRK and the Korean Peninsula has fed into domestic affairs as well?
I do. I think there's been a lot of groundswell and a lot of sort of confusion amongst South Korean people as to where America stands now in the alliance. And I think it is a growing sort of anti-Trumpism. The more that he sort of puts forward this agenda of this negotiating style of all or nothing. And so now when you have such an empowered South Korean public because of the whole impeachment process, it makes the decision-making and the policymakers also very sensitive to public opinion in this process. So it's really feeding into this whole sense of, South Korea's national interest not being the same and growing cleavages with the U.S. national interests.
Sonia, it's fun to be a journalist here for an international network in the first 100 days. You get the tweets, you get the 3 a.m. phone calls from your desk, I'm sure. But that aside, as you speak to audiences in France and across Europe, are they concerned too?
Yeah, in France, Donald Trump is still largely seen as a brash leader with no experience, with a very particular style. For instance, communicating by tweets. And the world also, and especially Europe, saw how so far he had little success. For instance, he didn't manage to implement his Muslim ban, the healthcare reform. So, I mean, largely in Europe, he's seen now as a leader who tried to act a lot, very fast, but very few results. But I think in the world, it will, his image, it doesn't have the same image, for instance, in the Middle East, where people are used to have a leader like that with kind of an authoritarian style and who criticize media. People didn't expect that much difference between the politics of Obama or Donald Trump. And for instance, his action in Syria lately, the attack on Syria airbase was largely applauded in the Middle East. So, depending on the region of the world, is not going to be seen is not going to have the same image. And I think overall, people are still very worried about his action and uncertainty, but maybe less scared than they thought they would be with a Trump president.
Interesting. Lester, domestically, a lot has been going on. He got a Supreme Court judge on his 100 days. That was what the base got really excited about. And I was looking at the polling. He's still very popular among Republicans and those among his base as well. What's going on here?
Well, I think for all of the kind of the fits and starts that we're seeing from kind of a conventional Washington perspective, where he wasn't able to pass a health care bill right away, his executive order on immigration was thwarted by the courts twice now. For all of that, at the same time, he's focused on issues that his base cares about, which is economic renewal, bringing jobs back to this country, getting a conservative on the Supreme Court to replace the deified Antonin Scalia. So those steps are gonna make him very strong with his base. And even though he has overall low approval ratings, he's always kind of had overall low approval ratings, all during the primary, and then during the general, his polling numbers were basically not very good. They're still not very good. We shouldn't interpret that as any kind of sign of weakness, despite kind of the setbacks he's had in the last few months.
But he seems a little frustrated. We've seen in interviews over the last couple of days that more hasn't been done, and a realization that the office is not quite what he thought the job was going to be.
Well, I think that's right. And he admitted the job was a lot harder than he thought it would be, and that it's taking more time, and he's having to work very hard. And that's good. Those are good realizations to have. And I think the other thing that's kind of heartening for me as a kind of a constitutionalist is that it's really difficult to be an authoritarian in the United States. You've got courts that will thwart you. You've got Congress that will either thwart you or disappoint you. And so there's really not a lot of room to move. So we've, as we kind of mentioned earlier, some of his successes have been on the international stage where he can act almost alone and showed decisiveness and strength. And so I think that's one of the reasons he's kind of ratcheting up attention on North Korea.
I'm glad you said that, because I want to play a bit of sound, because before the election and during the transition, there was a lot of China bashing going on. And then suddenly we've seen, especially since the Mar-a-Lago visit of President Xi, this amazing relationship develop. Let's just have a listen to Donald Trump in a recent interview.
I've established a very good personal relationship with President Xi. And I really feel that he is doing everything in his power to help us with a big situation. So I wouldn't want to be causing difficulty right now for him. He's a friend of mine. He's actually I think he's doing, an amazing job as a leader. And I wouldn't want to do anything that comes in the way of that.
Now, that was an interview to Reuters, Sonia, where basically everything that he said in the campaign and beforehand seems to have changed a lot. Same thing when it comes to NATO, too. What's the world making of this?
Yeah, I mean, that's the good surprise for the Europeans, because they were very worried about his stance on NATO, calling it obsolete. And but now he's saying that it's very important for the security of the world and the fight against terrorism. And he acts like, thanks to him, NATO is refocusing his fight against terrorism. And
forgetting the deployment in Afghanistan,
exactly.
for example. Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely going toward more a traditional, conventional foreign policy. And even if he campaigned on America first, he acted pretty quickly in intervening in Syria. So I think that some of the Europeans maybe are kind of reassured. It's not often the case, but by the fact that he listens to the generals in his administration. You have the Secretary of Defense General Mattis, General McMaster, and I think we can also see a shift in his foreign policy since he fired General Flynn. And I think that's something that maybe reassured the Europeans, the fact that seeing that he listened maybe more to Mattis or McMaster, and the rapprochement between Russia and the United States is not...
That's not happening.
It's not happening yet. So yeah, we're definitely going through a more conventional foreign policy, and that we could have expected.
Sonia brings up a good point about who's in charge, because that's another thing that we've seen in the last 100 days, isn't it? Is that this sort of battle, if you like, behind the scenes and actually in front of the scenes, between a lot of the economic nationalists that were brought in part of the campaign, Steve Bannon, but also more and more say for Trump's family, including Ivanka Trump and, of course, her husband, Jared Kushner, who are both senior advisors. Who's winning?
Unclear. I think that's a great question. Maybe President Trump is winning. I think the positive side of that is that he's really done a good job of bringing in a lot of different voices into his White House and into his administration. Even though there are all these jobs that haven't been filled yet, he's actually hearing plenty of different kinds of voices. He just said the other day he's both a nationalist and a globalist, right?
Is that possible?
I think it's true of everyone. Everyone's kind of got their foot in the realist camp and in the idealist camp, and that's appropriate for the United States. We should not be hidebound to one or the other, and each situation has to be judged on its own. There needs to be consistency, but you also need to be flexible to be able to deal with the situation in front of you. And I think one of the reasons he's starting to flip on some of the issues from the campaign is he's starting to encounter the world as it is, and there are limitations for what the U.S. can do, and there are only a narrow number of opportunities, and he's starting to realize that the more he's in this job.
And it's interesting also in terms of trade. I'm going to ask you this, Jenny, and also you, Sonia, where there was a lot of economic nationalism talked about, the cancelling of TPP, for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The European talks are on hold. They're going nowhere. Is that having a knock-on effect still, do you think, in Asia, for example, more protectionism, or is it more like Xi Jinping's Davos speech where they're talking about globalization?
For Korea, I think it's right now it's kind of seen as being a little bit of a bullying policy, and so the idea that they have to come with concessions in order to strengthen the alliance or reiterate the strength of the alliance, I think is a little bit insulting for the Koreans on this matter.
Because, Sonia, we had a weird thing where the White House took on Canada this week over wood and dairy, and everyone thought that they would be pointing the finger at Mexico and China as they came in, and that's happening. You're in the middle of a second round of a presidential election where economic nationalism is one of the key policies. Is that filtering through? Is Trump's message to America filtering through to Europe as well?
I mean, I think, yeah, definitely Europe is looking at what's doing Trump, and I think Marine Le Pen, for instance, saw that it was working in America, and even if Trump is not going to be as nationalist as he said during his campaign, this is the message that his voters still, remember. And if I talked to some of his voters lately, and they still mainly pretty happy with him, even if they criticize his style. They all say, that they're very happy for the economy. They have a lot of hope. So the messaging on the economy was very important. And Europe is hoping, that is not going to say everything that he say he will do. We had our Minister for Commerce that came a few weeks ago in America. We went to talk to the French companies, and they were pretty worried with what's going to happen. So we kind of the situation of wait and see. And definitely what Trump did here, Marine Le Pen is trying to do the same in France, and it's also working at a certain extent. But overall, I don't think this is the message that will reach out everyone in France. And for the relation between France and the European Union, I don't think it's going to change that much. But the messaging is very important.
Just to find out what, so he's not called China a currency manipulator. Right. He's not cancelled NAFTA. He's not done a lot of things in that contract with the American people that he said. What has he done that he said he would do, and what do you think his priorities are going beyond the 100 days?
So, as we said earlier, he put a conservative on the Supreme Court. That's going to resonate for years for him. And he's both fighting for American jobs and doing everything he can to be seen as fighting for American jobs. So I think a lot of the talk on trade and about trade deals kind of falls into the latter category, where he wants to start to look tough on international trade negotiations, even if the reality isn't always quite there. And that's what the American people hired him to do, was to fight for their jobs. And what he's thinking about is those swing voters in Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania.
The ones who got him elected, yeah.
That's right. And he's going to be playing to those voters for the next 3.5 years.
Fascinating. I can't believe it's only been 100 days. That's my takeaway. Les Munson, thanks so much. Sonia Dridi as well, and Jenny Tan so much. That's all we have time for. Join us, obviously, on the next episode of The Heat. The latest on the tensions on the Korean Peninsula will be our top story. Until then, I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.